Hey. Not sure what happened with the music there. We are trying something new tonight. You can probably tell. Well, thanks for joining us. Welcome programmers, welcome music lovers. Welcome to Code and Coda. See if we can keep ourselves together here today. All right. Where are my slides? Here we go. This is Code and Coda. Welcome. Again, thank you for joining us. We will make it to the end, I promise. Here we are streaming live from Boston, Massachusetts this evening. As always, on a Sunday. My name is Joseph Parzell. I am your host, a software developer and an app publisher from Clemson University, South Carolina. Go Tigers! And on guitar and piano tonight, for the first time piano, Mr. Eric Gaudette. Well, okay, here we go. Here's our abstract for Season 2. We're in Season 2. Remember, we started Season 2 last week. If you couldn't make it last week, welcome to Season 2 if this is your first time joining us for Code and Coda. This is kind of how we're breaking it down over the next few weeks. We did our Create episode last week. I showed y'all how to retrieve the solution from GitHub. Did you hear the word y'all just come out of my mouth? I told you I was from Clemson. Tonight we are in episode 2. That is build. I switched this around. Last week it said source and then build. Really doesn't matter. We're just here to write some code and listen to music, aren't we? Our technical specification for today's episode. We'll do a quick introduction to Code and Coda, of course. If you'd like to join the team and submit some code, go ahead and visit codeandcoda.com for the link to join the team, and I'll add you to the team. We'll go through that a bunch tonight. Don't forget YouTube chat is open, so come say hi. Text, tweet at, and let other people know that we are jamming out tonight. Why don't you go ahead and get them to join us here? We'll be here for the next 45 minutes to an hour listening to Eric and also working on our Alexa skill. Last week we worked on our web application a little bit. Our solution is written in C#, .NET Core. Today we'll work on that solution a little bit more, but we will create a brand new Alexa skill today. It doesn't really mean much. We're just going to go through the process one more time really quick. But creating this new Alexa skill will allow me to add you, the viewer, who would like to contribute code and help us test this solution. I can add you as a beta tester to the Alexa skill. We'll get into that in just a short while. I've also figured out the database that we're going to be using for this solution. It's actually pretty simple. We're just going to be using a spreadsheet. We don't have to get into anything too crazy like SQL database or anything like that. To open that spreadsheet, we will use C# and OpenXML. And then once we're done, I'll show you kind of the idea for our game menu. One of those functions on the game menu will be to get the high scores, so it's going to be a little bit of a backwards development process here, but we're going to go ahead and create a get high scores process today for our game. I don't even think I mentioned what our game really is yet. Some of you know. Some of you who have been to Granite State Code Review Nightly. We'll get into the details of the game that we're building this season. First, I'm going to go ahead and do our introduction to Code and Coda and then a 5-minute recap of last week's episode. Still looking for a cool name for my 5-minute recap. If you have any ideas, please send it my way. The snazzier the better. Okay, here we go. Introduction to Code and Coda. Why are we here? If this is your first time, then you should know this originally was my team's Thursday New England presentation. I was slated to speak back in April of this year, but that event got postponed and eventually canceled, and just like most other events these days, I decided to take my presentation online. And of course, online presentations are a dime a dozen these days, so dime a dozen. Did I say that correctly? Well, our slideshow presentation is a $100 bill because we have my man Eric Gaudette playing music in the background for us. Hopefully, excuse me, hopefully I won't bore you too much. Here's a pretty neat statement from my good friend Jim Wilcox. I hope you fit into the third quote there. Some current events to look forward to. Of course, Granite State Code Review Nightly is every night during the week at 9 p.m. And the call for speakers has been announced for Granite State Code Camp, which will be November 14th, 2020, a virtual event, of course. So head over to Granite State, I believe it's granitestatecodecamp.com. Of course, you can find it pretty easily if you just do a quick Google search. This is not the first year of Granite State Code Camp. Quick baseball update. No games going on right now of importance, but I thought it would be good to make note of the fact that the Red Sox are in last place in the AL East. They don't even have 10 wins yet this season, and we're already almost at the end of August. Pretty strange thing to see there, right? Well, if you like to see some celestial objects, we'll have a quarter moon this week coming in, and you should be able to see Jupiter near that moon. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our 5-minute recap from last week. Before I do that, it's probably a good idea to mute your Alexa device. Go ahead and hit that mute microphone button on your Alexa. Let's see how Alexa is doing tonight. Should we even ask? Is she just going to say the same thing? Alexa, what's going on?
Here's what's up. In Bloomberg Market Minute.
No, I don't want to know this.
Money Minute.
Alexa,
The coronavirus.
please stop. Well, hey, you know, she thinks we want the news, but right now we're just interested in code and music. Alexa, tell me a music joke.
Why did Mozart rush to the bathroom? To conduct his next movement.
Now that was not appropriate for Code and Coda. I was going to repeat that joke. We'll let you replay that on YouTube if you want to hear that. Thank you, Alexa, for that wonderful joke about Mozart. How about we go ahead and set this 5-minute timer here? Alexa, set timer, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, starting now.
Okay, here we go. Recap, here we go. Well, remember I introduced the poster for Season 2. Not much different. I actually think I want to create a new poster for Season 2, so maybe I'll have something new next week, I don't know. We talked about joining the team. There was a little bit of a different process last week that I went through, so I erased those slides. But if you go to the website, you'll see the Join Code and Coda Team button there. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but when you do that, you'll see this slide now. You won't see what I showed you last week. If you join the team, here's the Code and Coda Season 2 team. Not much going on there, but fill out that form, send me your email address, and I will add you to that team. We talked about opening up the source code in Visual Studio. The source code is now hosted in GitHub. If you don't have Visual Studio Code, it's pretty easy to download. Once you download and install Visual Studio Code, you will also need to install Git. So if you see this error message when you try to use the source control button in Visual Studio Code, go ahead and install Git on top of Visual Studio Code. Pretty easy to do, just a bunch of button clicks. Make sure you close and reopen Visual Studio Code. You come back and clone the repository using the URL for the Code and Coda solution. Save that repository to your hard drive so that you can start writing code yourself. But before you write your own code, it's probably a good idea to create your own branch, and this way you're not going to be creating any code that other people don't want. I can choose which code to pull into the master solution, which I will be doing every week on a weekly basis. Now I'm clicking through these slides. You can just see I'm going through this publish code process here. We went through this last week, but in Visual Studio Code, you will have to try and get used to some of these icons because they like to keep this really slick and neat and simple. So that means not a lot of text on the buttons. Stay with us during the season. If you have any questions about how to use Visual Studio Code, just send me that question in YouTube chat and I'll do my best to answer. So I've created the branch, I've published the changes, and I've synced the changes. Now, as the master developer, I showed you how I go into GitHub, check the solution, notice that the code was not there yet, so I went ahead and created a new pull request and retrieved the code that I wrote to my secondary branch called Joe's Branch. And after I completed the pull request, merged the new code, I went and checked the code one more time, and you see that the Joe is here text now shows up since I've completed the pull request. In order to see this code now back on my own desktop in Visual Studio 2019, I went to the Team Explorer tab in Visual Studio, clicked on the Sync button to get to the Sync section, clicked on Sync, and synced the project back down to Visual Studio. So now we see that code. Joe is here. I hope you remember that from last week. I know some of y'all weren't here, but I do know that some people watched the episode during the week, which is really nice to hear, that if you miss the episode, you can go back and watch the episode during the week. But what I think the most important part here is, and I hope you've already noticed, we've worked on the sound and the video for Code and Coda over the last few weeks during Season 1 and Season 2, and we've made quite some significant steps. And if you are an audiophile like myself, you'll probably notice that the sound is coming through a lot cleaner this episode and will be for the rest of the episode. So what that means is you can put this episode on during the week and leave it on in the background, put the music on your speakers, and hopefully when you hear Eric playing, you can also learn a little bit of C# at the same time. Alright, what am I talking about? I'm boring you guys. Let's kill this timer. I'm actually just waiting for this timer to go off after 5 minutes, but that was a quick recap, so. Alexa, cancel timer.
5-minute timer canceled.
Alright, thank you, Alexa. Let's get back to Eric and check Eric out for a minute. How about that? Well, here's our top contributor. I know we've only been doing this for half a week, but I will be keeping track of who contributes to the solution and try and report those results during each show. So, our top contributor from last week is Gabe, the only contributor. We're just getting started here. I know a few more C# lovers out there will be writing some code, contributing code to our GitHub solution. If you'd like to be one of those developers, let me know. Go to codeandcoda.com, click on the Join the Team button. You'll be taken to this forum right here. Pretty simple forum. Give me your name and your email address, and I'll be able to add you to the team and also add you as a beta tester to the Alexa skill. I'm going to try and go through these slides a little bit quicker just because these are a lot of button clicks. So remember, we're creating a new skill. There are a couple of new things here to keep in mind, but what I'm doing is calling the skill Code or Coda. Why are we calling this skill Code or Coda if the name of the show is Code and Coda? Well, that's because our game, I guess now's a better time than ever. Is that how the phrase goes? Now's a good time to tell you that we are going to be creating a game based off of the game show Deal or No Deal. I hope you've watched that game show before. It's a pretty neat show, pretty fun to watch. Seemed like a pretty simple game to try and mimic with C# and Alexa. So we're going to create a game called Code or Coda based off of the game show Deal or No Deal. Some of the options here, I'm creating a skill where I will provision my own web application. We went through this in Season 1. I'm going to host my web application in Azure. Of course, where else? Another button click. We're going to get through this creating skill process. And after I create the new skill, I jump down to the endpoint section. And I'm actually using the endpoint that I used for Season 1. I don't think it's quite hooked up yet. We'll get to that, but you can see that adding a domain is pretty simple. So there's my Azure domain, and I'm selecting my development endpoint as a subdomain because we are a subdomain of azurewebsites.net. But you don't have to worry about any of this because I'm going to create this skill, and you as a team member will be added as a beta tester for this skill. Before we get to that part, real quick, I'd just like to show you that after you create a new skill, you need to set up the invocation name. This is the phrase that the user will say to start your skill. By default, it starts with the phrase change me. So we will change that to say Code or Coda. So that now whenever somebody says Alexa, Code or Coda, our skill will start. It will be invoked. Once somebody starts our skill, the next thing the user will do is call an intent. By default, a new skill has a hello world intent, so I'm just going to go ahead and click on this delete button over here and get rid of that default out of the box intent. Yes, delete intent. And after that, I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new custom intent. And like I mentioned before, we're creating a process to retrieve the high scores of the game. So I'm going to call this intent high scores. Now this is not exactly what the user will be saying to start this intent. This is just a key identifier for the intent. This is the text that is sent to your web application during the request portion of the Alexa skill workflow. Remember, the utterances that we set up are the phrases that we think the user will say to trigger this intent. So, of course, we can add new utterances, such as high scores is one example of an utterance. So now once the user invokes our skill, they can say the phrase high scores and it will fire off the high scores intent. What other phrases might a user say to retrieve high scores? Well, you could probably come up with 1,000, but we'll just go ahead and put a few in here. I've added 6 utterances for this intent called high scores. So if the user says anything like this, the high scores intent will be fired off. After setting up this simple new intent, I click on the build button at the top. And after it runs the build, I bounce over to the test tab. I hope I'm not going through this too quickly, but you don't have to worry about completing this part. As a beta tester for this skill, you won't need to go through any of this. But if you have an Amazon Alexa account, you can go to the dev console and run this skill yourself. When you get to the test tab, if it says test is disabled for this skill at the top, it's real easy. You can click on that drop down and switch that to skill testing is enabled in development. After I did that, I typed in the invocation phrase code or coda just to see what would happen. And it looks like it didn't break anything, but I don't think I really got the response I wanted. You can see the request was sent, the launch request was sent, and the response is just an empty output speech object. So there is a lot more to do to hook up our skill to our web application. We're just kind of getting the skill built here. This is the build episode for season 2. And just as another quick test, I typed in the utterance high scores. After I typed the utterance high scores, you can see that the intent request was kicked off. That's what's sent to our web application. Still no valid response just yet. A couple more things I'd like to do here before we finish part 1. I'm just going to go ahead and put in a few details for this skill. And one detail I'd like to add just to make the skill a little bit more recognizable is I've created a logo for Code or Coda. So when I scroll down here, I can upload the Code or Coda icon, which is what I've done. Looks just like the Deal or No Deal logo. Little parody, never hurt anybody. Once I add those logos to the skill, I come over to the distribution tab, and under the availability section, I get to choose who gets to beta test my skill. Now, before I can beta test the skill, I have to answer these questions about the skill first. Pretty simple to do. After I answer those questions, I probably should have taken a screenshot of that. You really don't have to worry too much about it, but I added our buddy Jim, the Granite State hacker, as a beta tester. I haven't spoken with him yet to see if he's accessed that or not. I'll probably check in on YouTube chat right now to see how he's doing, how everybody else is doing. Take a sip of coffee here, and we'll get back and start with part 2 of episode 2 of season 2. 222. Be right back. Good evening, Karen. Good to see you here at Code and Coda. Alright, hey, there's our logo. Coda. I totally messed up my joke. Code or Coda. I just have Howie Mandel's voice in my head when I say that. Okay, let's get started with part 2. What are we waiting for here? In this part of the episode, we're going to do some C# here. I'm also going to show you the database that was created for this solution. Some things to keep in mind when you're working with OpenXML in Visual Studio. We're going to be using the document format.openxml packaging namespace. Within that namespace is a public class called spreadsheet document. And of course, in order to utilize this library or these libraries that we'll be using today, you need to include a using statement within your project. A couple of them. Let's take a look at that in code. But first, here's our database. I know it doesn't look like much, but a spreadsheet is a database too, right? I've named this spreadsheet Code or Coda. And the sheet has been named high scores. And what's the data that we have in these high scores? Well, basically it's just going to be 2 columns of information, a name and a score. Of course, it's important to keep this information sorted correctly. Although I suppose when we retrieve this information, we could sort it ourselves in the code. But you can see here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 players on the high scores list right now. Looks like Jim is in first with $100,000. So what this means is that some people have played the game, and somehow miraculously our code has added these high scores to the spreadsheet, to the database. We'll have to get to that part of the code a little bit later in the season, but for today, to keep it simple, I've just kind of hard-coded these figures in here, and we're gonna run some C# to get these figures out. And the first thing I am gonna do, and if you are a member of the Code and Coda team, if you've downloaded and cloned the solution, you might notice that I've made some changes to the solution. I've published a few of those changes, not all of them. The first change that I made here was I've published, I shouldn't say published, I've added the Code or Coda XLSX file to the www root folder, so that our project, our solution, can access that file. Step 1 done. Sweet. Now to get this spreadsheet published to GitHub, remember we're working as a team here, so anytime you make some significant changes like this, it's good to publish those changes on a regular basis so that your teammates can also have those changes and work on them as well. So what I've done is I've clicked on the Team Explorer tab down here in my solution, and once I click on that Team Explorer tab, I click on the Changes button, and that's going to show me all of the changes that I've made to the project so far. You can see the one change that's been made is the Code or Coda spreadsheet has been added to the project. So how do I get that into GitHub? Well, I will back up one step, and first I should make note, and I guess I didn't. Okay, so I'm missing one slide here. Basically, what you need to do is type in a comment. So underneath the word branch and then master, it says enter a commit message. So just enter some comments about why you are committing this code. Now I've gone in and I entered the text added spreadsheet to project or something like that. I can't remember. I didn't take a screenshot of that, but after I typed in those comments, I clicked on the commit all button. Now you need to type in comments before that button lights up and you're able to click it. After you click the commit button, you see that a message comes up, tells you the commit ID. It gives you a link to that commit information, but it also gives you a link to sync that information with the server. So I now click on the sync button. And I think I just found where I thought I had put my slide, because this is two slides together. I found the issue. All right, after I click on sync, here we go. You can see my comment, added spreadsheet for database as part of my outgoing commit, has been synced. And what about the code that we use now to access this spreadsheet? Well, the first line of code we're going to be writing is a using statement. Now this is different than the using statement that you see at the top of your code. We're not using a library in this case. The using statement is so that we can have appropriate garbage collection on our objects. So we are, with all file operations, in any language, when you open a file, it's always good to close that file and remove all the traces of that data from the program's memory. And using the using statement in C# gives you that ability, manages it for you. And before I zoom in, let me just show you really quick. We have the Alexa skill open here. This is the solution that's published to GitHub. This is what we worked on all season 1. You now have access to this code, and I've opened up the home controller C# file, and I'm not going to get too much into the code today. I just really want to focus on these first main functions that get the spreadsheet open in your code. In our code now, actually. So what I did at the bottom of the solution on line 252, you can see I created a function called getTopScore. This function is going to open the spreadsheet, retrieve those values, and return the high score, so that we can send that information back to Alexa, and then Alexa can tell the user what the high score is. Of course, like I mentioned, we are creating a using block here because we need to run appropriate garbage collection on our objects. Within that using declaration, we create a variable called doc. And we're using our library that we referenced, spreadsheet document. That's a class. That class has a method called open, and what we're doing is sending the file name to that method. Unfortunately, I have not added the using statements, the other kind of using statements, to my code at the top. So Visual Studio is telling us, hey, this namespace or the name of the class doesn't exist in the current context, meaning we need to reference the correct library. In order to do that, we need to download some files using Package Manager. If you've used Visual Studio before, you've seen this. Just click on Tools, and then NuGet Package Manager, and then we're gonna manage the packages for this solution. Which package are we going to be working on or downloading? Well, if you type in document format.openxml into the search at the top, you can see the first thing that comes up is by Microsoft, 20 million downloads, so you should be fairly certain this is a legitimate library. You can also look at the description and other details on the right hand side. And I've installed it to the Alexa skill project so that now we can use that library within our solution. Coming back to the spreadsheet document object here, I can click on the drop down. Now IntelliSense gives me the option to add that using statement at the top automatically. We've all done this a million times. So it adds the using statement for you at the top, and once you're done adding that reference, now you can see we have a valid object reference, class reference. Here are a few more lines of code just to get us started. You kind of really do need to drill into these objects. Using OpenXML may seem a little bit convoluted or too much when you're just trying to do a little bit, but the way that these objects are organized is very compartmentalized, so you really do need to create multiple object types here, parse through a few pieces of information to get to where we need to be. So the first thing we do on line 259 is create a workbook part. The workbook part is just a property of that spreadsheet document object. And on the next line, on 260, we create another object called workbook strings. And to get that, we use our workbook part and run the method, or actually drill through the properties, workbook part.sharedStringTablePart.sharedStringTable.child elements. Now, I've only used this library for .NET Core very briefly, and I know this doesn't seem very intuitive, but just bear with me. Once you get through this first initial part, you'll be able to get to the data that you need, and we'll be able to continue on writing our functions. So let's just go ahead and keep pushing through this here. After you create your workbook strings object, finally on line 261, we create one last object called workbook sheets. And so to get that object, we use the same workbook part, we find the workbook property, and we run the method called getFirstChild, and we pass the object type to the method. In this case, we still haven't declared one more using statement here, so our sheets object, our sheets class object type is underlined. Visual Studio thinks something's wrong here, but it also gives us the option to add one more using statement automatically. So I've clicked on the drop down for IntelliSense there. You can see it gives me the option to add that using statement automatically. So when I do, there's our first 3 lines of code written to access our spreadsheet database. The next 3 lines of code you can see here on 264, 265, and 266, just some more basic drilling down through objects and trying to find the specific object that you need. You can find a lot of this information, of course, in Microsoft documentation. That first line there, you can see creating the object, the sheet. I'm finding the workbook sheets object using the child elements property and just getting the first element. So remember, index 0 of any array is going to give us the first object in that array. And that's just because we have one worksheet in our spreadsheet, the high scores sheet. So I'm just kind of cheating here a little bit. Once you find the sheet, you're going to create another object called worksheet. Well, it's called current sheet, but the object type is worksheet. This couldn't get any more boring. To get that worksheet, you're going to use the ID of the sheet that we just created and get the worksheet property. You can see .worksheet at the end. And let's finish this. Finally, sheet data. What we're doing is getting the current sheet and the first child as a sheet data object. So we had to get a sheet and then change that to the current sheet, then get sheet data object. My oh my, just to get some information from a spreadsheet, you do have to go through a lot here. We'll show you what this all means in the next part. I need a break from all this worksheet sheet. Let's check in with Eric. Sounds good, Eric. You know, every time I switch to Eric on full screen, I get to remind myself to turn his volume up. Trying to be a little bit more consistent with these volumes and with the sound. You know, we've been working hard trying to get this sound great for y'all. Eric's been doing a great job with his equipment, getting things set up. And these tunes, just every week, I mean, his tunes are just awesome to listen to, so. I know it's getting late, so I will try and get through this last part real quick and show you where we landed after we wrote these lines of code. Now remember, to get the high scores, we're going to be firing off an intent request called high scores. And since we're using old code here from last season, I have to go in and update our switch statement. You can see our old switch statement here has the get teams and get messages intents built in right now. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those from our switch statement, and I've added a high scores case within our intent request switch block. So what this means is, here is the location of code in our solution that will be triggered when somebody invokes our skill code or coda and then says high scores or get high scores. This is where we are taken to in our code. So from here I've written a line that says speak plus equals get top score. Now remember, speak is what we are sending back to Alexa to speak to the user, in this case to the player. So we need to write a function that returns a string of information back to the speak object. Now, originally I named this function get top score. I decided to rename the object just to keep things more consistent. And within the code, if you rename a variable or an object or a reference to a function, Visual Studio has a nice feature that allows you to rename that function on the fly. So I renamed the function from get top score to get high scores right here in the code. And when I click on that drop down, since I've now renamed the function, it doesn't match the actual name of the function, which gives me an error. I need to rename that function, and I can do that easily with IntelliSense. So I am renaming get top score to get high scores. We've all done this before, right? After renaming that, you can see that I no longer get squiggly lines. Get high scores is the appropriate name of the function. And here is our HTML file from last season. Remember that we have a get page for our solution so that we can access our code without running the solution on our emulator. Here are the buttons from our get page from last season: the get teams, get messages, and go ahead and make a change. So I've changed the button from get teams and get messages to say get high scores, and on the right side here I've changed the data that is sent to the post form function in JavaScript. You might not remember all of this from last season. Sometimes I forget my own code too. But hey, trust me, we're all working together. We're all gonna run through this together during Code and Coda, so if you have any questions, let me know. Here's our get page from our solution and our new button that is going to fire off the get high scores intent. And just to check to see where we land when we fire off that intent, I created a breakpoint in our new function, in our get high scores function. Unfortunately, however, when I click on that button and run the code, I get an error, and I don't know what the error is. So what I did was I created a try catch block, a wrapper around my code here. I set the breakpoints again and run my code, and when I hit my breakpoint down here, The error message that's returned is could not find document. Well, that was my mistake. I thought I would be able to get away with just putting in code or coda here, but that's not the case. We do need to put this little prefix here that says www root. After doing that, add the www root to the beginning. It finds the file, no problem. Which is great, because if I come down here to the current sheet object, you can see all of the information is filled in here. This is all XML junk. We don't care about most of it. What do we care about? Well, there's the sheet data object that we created. I created a quick watch on that object, and this is the object that has all of our values for the high scores. Let me show you where that is. If you run the elements method on the sheet data object, you'll get an array of results returned. You can see here the count of those results is 5, and that's because we have 5 top scores. Well, it looks like we're on the right path here. When I expand the results view array, here's our 5 entries here. And I'm going to go one more down into the row. Remember, Jim was in the lead with 100,000. And if I expand that first row in the results array and then scroll down to the inner text property of that array, you can see the value 100,000 as a string. Man, oh man, we finally found that data out of the spreadsheet. Finally got there. There's a lot more to do though. A lot more to do. We got a lot more code to write. I hope you can join me. Come on back next week for episode 3. We're gonna continue building this solution. We have a few more parts to put together. And if you want to join us during Granite State Code Review, we'll talk about some more ideas for this game. Work on a few more functions. I hope you can join us next week. Actually, sorry, not next week, 2 weeks. September 6th. We're taking 1 week off. We may not return September 6th. We may take 2 weeks off. Hasn't been decided yet. It's actually going to be up to you guys. If you want to come back on September 6th, we'll have to figure that out, and I'll let you guys know for sure. Anyway, long episode. Sorry about that. A couple glitches, but hey, this was a big one to get through. We'll be back next week, trim it up, go through a little bit more code here. And of course, great music by Eric. Thanks again for joining us. It's Code and Coda. Streaming live from Boston, Massachusetts. Thanks.